goes on in the sex education classes in junior high and high school and talk about some of the things that are taught in these classes. And up here I have an article about what is taught in these classes that I'm going to read to you. But I want you to notice who this lady is that is talking about what is taught in the classes and where she comes from. It's talking about at some hearings for the U.S. Department of Education that was held on the sex education classes. And it says that one of those who testified at the Seattle hearings was Mrs. Janice Brozard of Bellevue, Washington, who for 3 weeks attended her 8th grade daughter's sex education classes. So we're talking about classes that are just up north of here, of what's going on in this area. And it says, as part of her testimony, she presented a questionnaire that was given to 13-year-olds in the 8th grade. And then here's a quote. It says, adolescent sexual behavior instructions indicate in the space provided the minimum age at which each of the behaviors listed is considered appropriate or acceptable in your value system. In other words, when is it okay to engage in blank? Now, I want you to realize, so that we're all thinking alike here, you know, in the schools, they've outlawed prayer in the schools, and religion is not something that is to be taught. So in their sex education classes, they have to leave religion out. They have to leave morals out. So there is nothing in here of a moral standpoint. Then it says, the child is then supposed to fill in the age for 25 activities. And here is just kind of a summary of the activities. Holding hands, kissing, French kissing, petting, masturbation, lovemaking with persons of the same sex, smoking marijuana, drinking booze, getting drunk or stoned, having intercourse, having a variety of sexual partners, living together, getting married, creating a pregnancy, having an abortion, taking birth control pills, becoming sterilized. Then the instructions to the teacher, said Mrs. Bozzard, and this is another quote, are that they are to section off the room. Is it okay before 14 or after 14? And the children are to physically get up from their seats and go over to those sections and indicate which of these or how they answered the questions. The obvious message sent to these youngsters is that all of these activities are fine. They need only determine for themselves the appropriate age at whence to commence. So this is just a sampling of what goes on in sex education classes. So what I want us to do tonight is to take a list, or this list that they have given here, of some of these things that they talk about at which age should you do these things. And I want us to talk about these things as if there were no God. Because that's what they're doing in their sex education classes. They are approaching these subjects as if there were no God. And so these students are going to have to discuss these things in intelligent ways just based on medical and psychological facts and evidence. And I want us to see that there is a tremendous amount of medical and psychological evidence available today that if we examine these things strictly from a worldly point of view, there is a lot of evidence that's going to show that God's way is really best. Now, for us to examine these things as if there were no God is something that is really honorable, because the book of Ecclesiastes is written about life under the sun. As if there were no God, what is man's purpose on life? Why are we here? What is going to make us happy? And that whole book is designed to answer the question of what life is without God. Another reason why I think it's honorable for us to examine these things without the view of God in them is because I believe that God can stand the test of medical and psychological evidence that doctors have discovered today. He can stand the test of true science to prove that His ways are really best. So what I've done, I have a chart up here, and the little announcement about what we're going to be talking about in class. I had on there a sentence about how that sexual purity was one of the nicest things you could do for yourself, even if you were an atheist. So I have up here, how can atheists have fun? Let's suppose, for example, that we're an atheist. We don't believe in God. All we want to do is have fun. We see television shows, we read magazines, we hear our friends talk, and obviously sex is something very important. This is something that the world thinks a lot of, and so as an atheist, we want to know, how can we get the most out of the sexual relationship? How can we really have fun? Okay, here's some things that were on our list that we just read that the kids were to put down. At which age do you start? Petting, masturbation, and so on. What we're going to do is we're going to discuss each one of these things in order and talk about them purely from a worldly standpoint. Is this the way to have fun? And we're going to leave God out of it in the beginning of our discussion, and then I will come back and make a few comments and show you how that God's way really is best and God can stand the test of science. The first one they had on here, petting. At what age should you start petting? Now, last week we saw that petting and fondling is involved in fornication, and this is something God doesn't approve of. But the atheist isn't concerned about what God thinks about it. Is petting something that's going to be harmful to the atheist that wants to get the most out of the sexual relationship? Now, as far as boys are concerned, I don't know about a lot of physical or emotional danger involved in petting for boys. But there is a certain amount of danger to girls if they're going to want the most out of this relationship if they give in to petting. I have talked to enough women over the years to know that women who are involved in heavy petting during their high school and junior high years, girls who think that this is a way to get along with boys and who are only willing to go so far, I've talked to enough women to know that when these women get married, they have serious sexual hang-ups. These women think that petting is what sex is all about. They're a lot more interested in petting with their husband than they are in having sexual intercourse with their husbands. And there is a tremendous amount of frustration on the part of these wives, and these wives have an inability to respond to their husbands. Now, one thing we're going to see about every single thing on this list is that something that we need to understand about our sexual nature. Whether we are an atheist or a Christian, we're all made this way. Our sexual nature is something that is developed and learned. And what we do during the years of puberty through early adulthood especially, these mold and affect the way we respond sexually for the rest of our lives. And I'm going to be giving you example after example as we talk about each one of these things. So we need to realize that our sexual nature is something that is learned, and when we start engaging in petting, then we are teaching our body how to respond sexually. We are teaching our body that this is what sex is all about. But this is not what sex is all about. This is a very immature form. And so this is something that a lot of times causes women to be frigid in marriage because they have engaged in this type of activity in a prolonged and heavy atmosphere during their courting years, and they have tricked their body into believing that something is really part of sex or the sexual union when really it is not. So petting is not something that is safe for girls. It is something that can be damaging to her budding sexuality and can teach her body to respond in an artificial way. Now, another thing on the list was masturbation. And at what age should a student start to do this? Now, sometimes students may think, well, this is a safe way to drain off my sexual frustration and to get rid of it and to get involved in masturbation, and this is something that is not going to harm me. However, that is not true. Masturbation is something that does have a profound effect on both boys and girls. Now, in the sex education classes, one thing they like to do a lot is make fun of teaching in the past about masturbation. And this is a picture that comes directly out of a Victorian manual on Victorian sexual morals. And back during the turn of the century, they taught that masturbation caused pimples. They said bright, fiery red pimples with black heads were caused by masturbation. Girls who were flat-chested, this was caused by masturbation. And of course, in the sex education classes, they like to point to these ridiculous beliefs that we had at the turn of the century and say, see there, this is what people think, and we know that this is not true, and this is ridiculous, and masturbation is something that is harmless. However, masturbation is not a harmless activity. Several years ago, I guess maybe about 15 or 17 years ago, when the Ms. magazine first came on the market, Back at that time, all the ladies' magazines, all the respectable ladies' magazines had little ads in there. Send for a free Ms. magazine, brand new ladies' magazine. And you can try it for free, and if you like it, you just keep it and don't do anything, and we'll bill you later. If you don't like it, let us know, and we'll take you off the mailing list. My husband saw these ads, and he says, well, you ought to send for this magazine. There'll be a lot of good material in there for your ladies' classes. So I sent for the magazine. I don't know if the first issue I got was the premiere issue or not, but it was one of the first 3 issues of Ms. Magazine. When Ms. Magazine came, it opened up to the front, and the very front of it just opened up naturally, and they had a 2-page spread of some artist's drawing. It took me a little while to figure out what in the world it was I was looking at. But after I looked at it for a little while, I began to realize that I was looking at that some artist had drawn his view of a woman's genitalia, and this is what you were looking at. This article was written to teach women how to masturbate. As I started to read the article a little bit, it soon became very obvious to me that this was what this article was about. And as they were teaching women how to masturbate, they were teaching women how to be lesbians. Lesbians, being a lesbian, is a learned response. Nobody is born being a lesbian. It is someone who has learned to do this during these years of when their sexuality is budding and forming. They are engaging in masturbation, and they are teaching their body an artificial way of response. Now, as I began to read this article and to understand what this article was all about, I thought, boy, I don't want this in my mind, and I did not read all of the article. Back at this time, we lived in Spokane. There was a bookstore called Pastime, run by feminists. The name was Pastime. It's pastime for women to stand up for their rights. I would go to the bookstore frequently because they continually had free literature or very inexpensive literature that I could get, and so that I could be aware and not be naive about what was going on and involved in the lesbian, or not the lesbian, the feminist movement. I would see their advertisements for lesbian softball games at the local park. And as I became more and more aware of their material, it became clearer and clearer to me that these women know that this is a learned response. And they were continually trying to teach people how to learn to do this. So it is not something we are born with. It is something that is learned. The hardcore feminists know that you can teach anybody to do this. And if you take them when they're young enough, just as their budding sexuality is coming into being, then you can make that person think, I was born this way, when really they weren't. They had just strictly taught their bodies to do this. So lesbianism is something that comes from masturbation. Girls sometimes get to doing it with each other thinking it's harmless. It's not harmless. Tim LaHaye, in his book, The Unhappy Gays, he says all gays were heavy masturbators in their youth. That this is something where they get involved in, and it leads them into this activity, causes them to think that they were born this way. He says a lot of homosexuals got involved in what he calls gang masturbation, where boys would get together and they would do this in gangs as a gang activity. And this is something that is teaching their bodies to respond in an artificial way, and it is teaching their bodies to think that this is normal and that this is what the sexual relationship is all about, when really it is not. So masturbation is something that is not safe. It is not something that is harmless. So it's teaching our bodies to respond in an artificial way. Now, the sad part about it, when you think about homosexuals, you think, well, maybe they're happy, and maybe they're, if we're an atheist and we don't care, well, maybe I would be happy this way, and it really wouldn't make any difference. Except gays are not happy, and this is where Tim LaHaye's title comes from, The Unhappy Gays. This type of activity is not what sexual love and what sexual sex is really all about, and because it is not what sex is all about, it is not very satisfying. And gays, the gay men, are some of the most promiscuous men on the face of this earth. There are lots of authorities that say that they are. They are continually looking for a new body, a new thrill, some type of artificial means to satisfy themselves, because they are not satisfied in this relationship. So this is not a satisfying or a fulfilling relationship, and it is not something that is going to make people happy. Now, suppose that the person we're talking to, excuse me just a minute. Suppose this atheist says, well, I'm not going to become a lesbian, or I'm not going to become a homosexual. I'm not going to carry it that far. I'm just going to use this while I'm in high school to drain off my sexual energy so that I won't be messing around with girls and getting girls pregnant and having all of these other problems. Well, even if a person does not carry it to its logical end of homosexuality, when it comes into the marriage, it still brings problems with it. Men who have been masturbators in their youth, a lot of time when they marry, then they have learned an artificial way of responding sexually, and they many times are turned off by sex. They're not as interested in sex as perhaps their wife is. And women who are frustrated in the sexual relationships many times are married to men who were heavy masturbators in their youth, who learned an artificial way of responding, who are heterosexual. They're interested in women, but yet they have denied their body its supreme joy in this relationship, and they have taught themselves an artificial way of responding so that they are unable to enjoy this relationship with their wife the way they should. The same is true with women. All you have to do is read Dr. Ruth's column very many times, and you know this is true. Women are continually writing Dr. Ruth and saying, Dr. Ruth, I can masturbate and bring myself to an orgasm, but when I'm with my husband, I can't do it. And he is so hurt. He is so frustrated. What's wrong with me? Now, sometimes Dr. Ruth gives good advice and says, you've learned to respond in this way in the past, and your body has learned this. You've got to wean yourself off of it and teach yourself the way to respond with a man. Sometimes she will say that. Or sometimes she'll say, well, what's wrong with that? Just make that be part of your relationship with your husband. And because this is not what sex is all about, women many times, just like the homosexuals, are continually cruising and looking for a new mark, someone new to bring into their relationship. Women are not all that satisfied either. And so many times when you read Dr. Ruth is continually recommending that women use machines, vibrators, things like this, because masturbation is not what sex is all about. It's not enough by itself. So for a student to come along and to hear a teacher say, at what age should you start doing this? Well, the age for masturbation is never, because it is too dangerous, because it teaches our body artificial ways of responding, and it's going to be something that is going to cause us problems later on. Now, when masturbation is involved, a lot of times young men, because it is not fully satisfying in itself, a lot of time young boys get involved in reading pornography. You need something else to put with it in order to get your thrills. And so young boys will get involved in reading pornography, things of this nature. They carry it on into their marriage. Their wives are frustrated. Their wives feel rejected. And there is not this happy relationship that there should be. I have a newspaper article here where Dr. James Dobson, who has written a lot of books that we're familiar with, Tough Love and different books on children and things like this. And he was on one of the president's committees for the family. And in part of his work, he interviewed Ted Bundy. And of course, we know that Ted Bundy is a killer from our area up here who has killed many women. And in finding out, talking to Ted Bundy about why it is he did this, Ted Bundy said, it was important to me that I'm not blaming pornography. He says, I take full responsibility, which he should. And he says, but he said, hardcore pornography guided and shaped what he did. As a boy of 12 or 13, Bundy said, he began reading violent, hardcore pornography and detective magazines that he found in garbage cans. But after a time, Bundy said, that no longer satisfied him, and he wondered what it would be like to carry out his urges. So he learned these things. He taught his body these things through reading these type of magazines and through thinking about these type of magazines. You know, Playboy does not make their money by writing articles about husbands loving and being loving and gentle with their wives. That doesn't sell magazines. They have to go to the bazaar and to the cruel in order to sell magazines. And so this is something we need to realize. These are not activities that are harmless, that a person can do for a little while and then not reap the benefit of it. Now, the Bible does deal with masturbation. In Leviticus, and then your homework that you're going to be reading, you're going to be reading something about this too. But in Leviticus 15, verses 16 through 18 and verses 32, and then in Deuteronomy 23, verses 9 through 11, this is where God gave the clean and the unclean laws, where if a man had a wet dream during the night, then he was unclean for the day. He couldn't go out and work. He couldn't go out and associate with his family. He had to go off and be by himself for the day because he was considered unclean. Now, when you read this chapter on these clean laws, you're going to find out that God wasn't saying this was a sin or this was evil, because God had exactly the same laws in regard to women and their menstrual cycle, that they were unclean. These were laws of protection. Back then, they didn't have microscopes and psychologists to know the danger of all of these things. So God gave them clean and unclean laws to protect them from germs and from bad social habits. And that is simply what this is. When a young man began to enter adolescence and have his wet dreams, then he was discouraged by these laws from giving in to masturbation. And he was discouraged from becoming a homosexual. And as a result, he was encouraged to get married, to have a lawful outlet for his sexual drive. And of course, this was the Jews' plan. They got married at an early age. And so this was God's way of helping them keep themselves pure and avoid these other things. So this is something that was good. Now, the way I treat this in children, when I view, a lot of times little children try to touch themselves and they get involved in masturbation. And if we have a problem like that in our home, I would suggest that the first thing a parent do is get rid of all of your colored toilet paper. Even for little boys, get rid of your colored toilet paper. Colored toilet paper has a dye in it that many people are allergic to. It causes them to itch and to want to scratch. And a lot of times you can immediately eliminate the problem by just going to the plain old generic white toilet paper. If that doesn't work, then I treat it like thumb sucking. I don't want my children to suck their thumb because it's going to cause problems with their teeth and it's not a good habit to get involved in. But yet I don't want to make a big issue out of it so it becomes a bigger problem because of the way I'm dealing with it. So when I would see my children sucking their thumb, I just go pull it out and say, oh, you don't want to be doing that, and go on and ignore the situation. And pretty soon I would notice that they weren't doing that anymore. So if we see our child getting involved in masturbation, then it's something that we need to treat in a casual way so that we don't create a problem, but so that we also do not encourage a habit which is going to lead to further problems. We can also protect our boys by having them get involved in sports, helping them get involved in physical activities that drain off a lot of their energies. And so it's something that we need to think about and we need to plan about. Something that I'm doing with my son, simply because I'm aware that homosexuals are roaming. They're always looking for marks. They are attracted to young boys, and realizing that he could be a victim of someone like this, is that I continually remind him that there are people who may do something to you and then tell you, if you tell your mother or your dad, you're going to get into trouble. And I tell him that if someone ever tells him that, if you tell your mother or dad this, you're going to get into trouble, to come and tell me, because he will not get into trouble. But that person is telling you that because he knows he will get into trouble, and he doesn't want you to get him into trouble. So we need to have dialogue going on with our sons, realizing that this is a very real, serious problem, to help protect them from growing up and getting involved in homosexual activity simply because someone came along, wanted them to be involved in group masturbation, or told them that this is something that was okay, and they, in their innocence, did not know that it was something that was going to lead to something that is dangerous. So we need to realize and to not be naive and try to protect our sons from this damage. Now, in 1 Corinthians 7, I want us to look at God's teaching on this a little bit more. In 1 Corinthians 7, we think about masturbation for both boys and girls. 1 Corinthians 7, of course, you know this is God's laws regarding marriage and the sexual conduct. And until I taught the Song of Solomon just for teenagers, I had never really thought of 1 Corinthians 7 being written to teenagers. But you remember that the Jews got married at an early age, and if you look over in verse 36, it says, "But if any man thinks that he is acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter, and if she should be of full age, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let her marry." I think 1 Corinthians 7 is talking about teenagers. And because of our age that we live in, we tend to think about it for older people. Now, it applies to older people too, but it is addressing teenagers at where they are in their sexual development and in thinking about getting married. Now, in chapter 7, verse 1, it says, "Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is not good for a man not to touch a woman." You think Paul is negative on marriage, but he isn't, because when you look at the second half of the chapter, he's talking about people who were getting ready to undergo a persecution. They were getting ready to suffer because they were Christians, and he's saying it's a lot easier to withstand spiritual persecution if you don't have a wife to worry about or children to worry about. So he's talking about regulations during persecution. Then as you continue reading in chapter 7, verse 2, he says, "But because of immoralities, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband fulfill his duty to the wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." Many times I've heard this verse 4 misused, where people have said that this means that the husband has the right to his wife's body anytime he wants, and the wife has the right to her husband's body anytime she wants. I don't think this is what Paul is teaching here. When he says a wife does not have authority over her own body, he is teaching that women do not have the power within themselves to satisfy themselves sexually. A woman cannot give herself full sexual satisfaction through masturbation. The same is true for a man. A man cannot satisfy himself fully through masturbation. It takes a man to satisfy a woman. It takes a woman to satisfy a man. So for these reasons, we need to get married, and we need to look to our legitimate, lawful member of the opposite sex to satisfy these needs. And then he says, "Stop depriving one another except by agreement for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, lest Satan tempt you because of your lack of self-control." And when he says, stop depriving yourself, there's an element of time involved in here in stopping to deprive yourself. It's for a limited time this agreement for a time is a limited period of time. It's not a prolonged, endless time. Well, I've just decided I'm not going to ever need this relationship again ever, so let's just leave sex out of our relationship. It's not that kind of an agreement, but it's an agreement for a time, for maybe some kind of where we're talking about persecution here, some kind of a physical problem where you need to pray for strength to endure the persecution, whatever. Then you make this agreement for a limited time, and then you come back together lest Satan tempt you. A lot of times teenagers have the attitude, well, we're living in the age of the bomb, so we might as well get out and get all we can and enjoy it while we can, because who knows if we're going to be here tomorrow. And my daughter's told me stories about things that friends at school have said, so I know that teenagers talk that way. They worry about the bomb. They think about the bomb. Well, if that is a real, legitimate worry that a teenager has, then Paul's instructions here in 1 Corinthians 7, when these people were getting ready to undergo a persecution, they apply. When you're under a time of stress and persecution, then you keep yourself pure. You don't turn your back on God. You make sure that you keep yourself sexually pure no matter what. Now, as we continue thinking about masturbation and how it leads to other problems, I want us to come down and to notice the next thing on here, which is part of what we've already been talking about, is that masturbation then is something that leads to lovemaking with persons of the same sex, homosexuality or lesbianism, depending upon whether it's a male or female. So masturbation, you've got to have this first before you get involved in this. And then once people get in this, if we're an atheist and we just want to have the most fun in life and we want to get the most out of life, is this something that we should be involved in, finding love with a member of the same sex? Well, as I've already said before, our bodies are not designed for this type of relationship. So 2 female bodies do not fit together perfectly. 2 male bodies do not fit together perfectly. And people involved in these type of relationships are frustrated, and they are continually looking for greater and better ways to stimulate themselves and to find a happy relationship. I want us to talk about AIDS and the effect on teenagers a little bit for a few minutes. And I think we all probably know that AIDS basically came into this country through the homosexual community. I have up here an article that is written by Masters and Johnson, and they had a new book come out called Crisis: Heterosexual Behavior in the Age of AIDS. This book came out a couple of years ago. And those of you that have Volume 2, if you'll look in the back in the index, you will see Masters and Johnson's name, and you can look up, and I've got some information about Masters and Johnson. Masters and Johnson's about, I don't remember, probably about 10 years ago, or maybe it was 20 years ago, had a tremendous effect upon the morals of our country when they came out with their study about human sexuality. And when you go back and look at the way that they developed their statistics and their rules about human sexuality, scientists today do not have a lot of confidence in Masters and Johnson's figures because they said their test subjects were not reliable. Masters and Johnson used only people who could perform in a laboratory with lights and cameras and all kinds of mechanical wires hooked up to them. They used people who could perform with multiple partners. If you didn't have a partner, they would find you one, or they would find you a machine. This is what Masters and Johnson's statistics are based upon. And I am telling you this so that you can appreciate the fact that Masters and Johnson do not care about God. Masters and Johnson do not care about morality. So the things that I am going to read you that they say have nothing to do with God, have nothing to do with morality. These are just based upon what is happening in the world today because of AIDS. So I want you to appreciate that fact. Okay, they say they're concerned about, as I said, part of their title is heterosexual or male and female behavior in the age of AIDS. They're saying that certainly bisexual males represent one of the earliest vectors of this crossover, that AIDS have come into the heterosexual community through bisexual men who could respond to both men and women. And this is something that is very popular sometimes on college campuses, teaching people if you really want to be loving, then you should be able to respond to people of both sexes. And they say that the AIDS virus is slowly but surely working its way into the younger population, the 15 to 24-year-old age group, which has, at least in the last quarter century, been the primary wedge driving epidemics of sexually transmitted diseases in the United States and elsewhere across the world. So they're saying that the 15 to 24-year-olds in our country are the ones who have always made all sexually transmitted diseases be at such a high rate. The highest rate of these diseases are among these age group of people, and that AIDS is coming into this age group. Equally alarming is the not unexpected concentration of infection among heterosexuals with what used to be called highly promiscuous patterns of sexual behavior, but might now be better labeled sex with multiple partners. So here it is, they're trying to tone down the word promiscuous and using just sex with multiple partners. People who elect to have numerous sexual contacts with multiple partners in the era of huge medical campaigns about genital herpes and AIDS tend to be people who don't think they are personally at risk for these infections. Their denial of risk not only allows them to maintain their pattern of sexual behavior in a relatively worry-free state, but also means they will be unlikely to use standard precautions for so-called safe sex. And so here it is. It says there's a huge number of people that think that this cannot happen to me, and because they think that, they're not taking precautions. They're going ahead and engaging in multiple relationships, but yet these people are the ones who are really at risk. In their study, and I do not have here how many people they used for their study. I've lost that number, but I can get that for you later if you're interested. But in their study of people that they polled and tested for this book that they wrote, they had 24 people who were infected with the AIDS virus. And they said if each of the 24 infected people in the non-monogamous group, so these are people who are not having sex with just one person, so they're multiple partners, so if each of the 24 infected people in this group is having sex with 15 others in the course of a year, then these 24 people have directly exposed 360 people to the virus through their sexual meanderings. If each of these 360 people has sexual contact with only 5 additional partners, an additional 1,800 people will have been potentially exposed by the original group of 24. So a group of 24 people, by them, this is just 2 generations down the line. They have sex with 15 people. Those 15 people only have sex with 5 more people. And so then you have 1,800 individuals involved. Now, here is their advice. Sexual choices in the age of AIDS. This is Masters and Johnson talking. People who care nothing about God. You know what their number one choice is to make? Abstinence. Avoiding sexual contact. It says, although the choice does not have much appeal to most adults, there is something to be said for a deliberate decision to abstain from sexual activity as a means of completely avoiding the risks of sexual exposure to the AIDS virus. To serve this purpose, though, abstinence can't be a part-time proposition. It must become, in effect, a way of life. This is what Masters and Johnson are saying. If you want to avoid AIDS, this is the only way to do it. Then they say safe sex is your second choice. And they say there is one set of circumstances under which all forms of sexual activity can be considered totally and completely safe from the standpoint of exposure to the AIDS virus. They're saying there's only one kind of safe sex. That is, of course, a relationship where both partners have no prior sexual contacts with anyone else and have not been exposed to the AIDS virus by non-sexual means. So what do they say safe sex is? One partner. They because of the AIDS virus, and these people who care nothing about God, then they realize that this is the way it has got to be. Now, as they continue, they're talking about safe sex. A lot of times you hear safe sex. Dr. Ruth talks about safe sex all the time. You read it in Ann Landers and Dear Abby. You see this thrown around all the time, and it's something that our students are going to be hearing from school. And their comment about that is, while it is true that condom use can effectively reduce the risks of unsafe sex, it is emphatically not true that condoms provide a foolproof means of avoiding exposure to the AIDS virus. As most people realize, they provide only a flimsy barrier, and they are subject to manufacturing or packaging defects that may cause them to leak. Then, Masters and Johnson have a special word to teens, or about teens. They say, thus far, AIDS has primarily affected adults in the 20 to 40-year-old age bracket, but experts fear that teenagers will be the next major target of the epidemic. Many teens are sexually active, and many teens use drugs. Both activities put them right in the path of a speeding locomotive. Okay, and it says many of the curricula supposedly teaching teens about the AIDS epidemic doesn't discuss homosexuality or bisexuality at all, and doesn't make them realize that these are ways that these diseases come into the high school in ways that they can be exposed to them. Now, having said that from Masters and Johnson, I want to read you another quote, and this quote is talking about safe sex also, and it says while condoms have been shown to be impermeable to the AIDS virus under laboratory conditions, the only study to date on the efficiency of condoms in heterosexual intercourse found that they fail to prevent transmission 17% of the time. So while they can make condoms be safe in the laboratory, they cannot make them be safe in the field. It says this failure, so using condoms for safe sex, the failure rate of them means this failure is similar to the risk of playing Russian roulette. It says the emphasis on condoms also ignores the role of saliva as a means of transmission during sexual intercourse. Then it quotes two doctors here, and the first one is Dr. Helen Singer Kaplan. And I quote from Helen Singer Kaplan quite a bit in Volume 2. She is a leading sexologist during our day. She's very conservative in her views. She writes lots of articles in the ladies' magazine. So if you take any ladies' magazines, I'm sure you have read her articles, whether you remember her name or not. As far as her books and things that I've read, I've never seen her mention God or anything like this. She is coming this strictly from a psychologist's point of view, and this is what makes people happy. Notice what she says that she, and then the other doctor is Clifford J. Sager, and I do not know who he is. These two doctors warned, there is no such thing as safe sex. The use of barrier contraception may reduce, but does not stop sexual transmission, advising persons who are carriers or persons in high-risk groups who have not been tested and may be carriers that it is safe to have sex with condoms is false, provides an erroneous sense of security, and can kill partners. So this is what people who do not care anything about God are saying. Here's someone else who has something to say about safe sex. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop. He said, abstinence is the only way you can be perfectly protected against AIDS. The next is through the establishment of a mutually faithful, monogamous relationship where you have one man and one woman who are faithful to each other. And he says, if the people who hear this message are foolhardy enough not to accept it, then as a public health officer, I have to say there is protection in a condom. Now, he is the Surgeon General, and he says people are going to be foolhardy and not accept what I say, so I have to tell them as a health officer that there is safety in a condom. But listen to what he says about condoms. If you are going to be promiscuous, it is better to use a condom than not to use one. But that is like saying, if you're going to go over Niagara Falls, it is better to have the protection of a barrel. So this is his illustration there. He says, we need to alert administrators and teachers that condoms do not mean safe sex. Condoms are the least effective birth control device, having a failure rate of 14 to 32% among married couples. So he's saying condoms are the least effective thing that we have just for controlling the birth rate. Then he says the failure rate for AIDS will no doubt be higher because condoms are made of semi-permeable material, so they're made of material that can be penetrated, and the AIDS virus is, listen, 500 times smaller than a sperm. This is what the Surgeon General says. There is no such thing as safe sex. Here's another article about teens and the rising virus. This says that 1 in 7 teenagers annually contracts a sexually transmitted disease. So this is talking about all sexually transmitted diseases. That 1 in 7 teenagers every year contracts one. And it says down here that they've estimated that only 1/3 of sexually active teenagers use contraception regularly, and less than 1/4 of those who practice contraception use condoms. So only about 1/3 of the teenagers use some form of contraceptive. And it says, thus far, AIDS has been diagnosed in 184 youths aged 13 through 19. And I want you to understand what I'm saying. So far, 184 youths aged 13 through 19 have developed AIDS. And it says, however, AIDS has been diagnosed in 9,377 young adults aged 20 through 29. The agency said, and it says, because the incubation period between exposure to the virus and the onset of symptoms can be quite long, from 7 years or more, and another article I read said even up to 10 years after you've been exposed. It can take 7 to 10 years for you to develop the symptoms. Many young adults with the disease presumably were infected with the virus as adolescents. So there are lots of adolescents who are infected with the AIDS virus who will not know it until they get into their 20s because of the long incubation period. And this is something that I think girls need to be aware of this. Girls need to be aware of the tendency of many times of boys to be involved in heavy masturbation and homosexual activity, homosexual experimenting, to realize that they can think they're safe, but they need to realize that boys and girls have different views towards these things, and they are not safe. Okay, here's some more results about teenagers. It says, as a result of new evidence from behavior studies of teenagers in San Francisco. So you'd think if there's ever a place where teenagers would practice what so-called safe sex, it would be San Francisco. Okay, it says, in the San Francisco, it says the results were disquieting. Researchers found that though teenagers intellectually understood the dangers of getting acquired immune deficiency syndrome, which is AIDS, through sex, they understood about AIDS, they understood the danger of it, only a fraction of them acted on the information and adopted safe sex practices, most notably condom use. So they knew and they understood, but only a few of them in San Francisco acted on it. The researchers in Massachusetts reported that although safe sex programs in a group of affluent, college-educated gay men produced dramatic decreases in such high-risk behaviors. So here it is. This survey was made in Massachusetts of affluent, college-educated gay men who ought to know better. It said when they were educated about this, it created dramatic decreases in their high-risk behavior. But then notice what it said. The period of progress lasted only about 6 months. So these men learned what was right. They knew they were high risk, and it was only for 6 months that they were able to practice safe sex. So this is something that we need to be aware of, is something that is very dangerous. Here's a recent Reader's Digest article that says that by the year 2000, it's only 10 years away, they estimate that 15 to 20 million people will have been infected by the AIDS virus. I have a clipping here from a newspaper about a doctor and his wife, who's a nurse, who are suing a hospital in San Francisco because they would not allow the nurses to wear gloves when they were treating AIDS patients. Now, this lady did not contract AIDS. But her suit, what it's involved in is that because AIDS attacks the immune system, lots of diseases that used to be considered rare in our country are now becoming more and more prevalent because these people with AIDS do not have the ability to fight them off. And you can catch all kinds of horrible diseases from people infected with AIDS. Most AIDS patients do not die of AIDS. They die of AIDS-related diseases. She contracted some kind of a horrible disease, and when she got pregnant, it infected her newborn son so that he is now handicapped. She can never have any more children. She can never again work as a nurse because of this disease that she has, and she did not get AIDS. She got an AIDS-related disease because of all of the horrible diseases that go along with it. So this is something that is very serious, and it's something that we need to be concerned about, and we need to realize how promiscuous homosexuals are, and to protect ourselves from this disease the best we can. If I was someone who was not married, whether I was a teenager or a widow thinking about getting married, then I would make a pledge to myself that I would not marry anyone who would not take the blood test to determine whether or not he had the AIDS virus, because girls are just too naive in the behavior of boys in this area, and it's too easy to be fooled. Masters and Johnson, in their article, they told about a young girl who married a man whom she thought was a virgin. It turned out he was a heterosexual virgin. He had had all kinds of homosexual contacts, but she was the first girl he had been with, and he brought AIDS into their marriage. I read another article about a woman who was very bitter. She had just buried her husband. They'd been married about 5 years, and he died. He had been a virgin up until the month before they got married, and he thought, well, I'll just go have one last fling and find out what it's all about before I get married. That one fling gave him AIDS, and his wife now is very bitter. She had this beautiful life planned with this man. He is dead. She now has AIDS and is trying to deal with the bitter feelings that she has, all because he wanted one last fling. So this is something that is very serious. As we continue looking down the list, if we don't care anything about God and we just want to have fun, well, lovemaking with persons of the same sex is not without its risk. What about having intercourse or getting involved with someone else and maybe having what they're calling a monogamous relationship? Of course, the danger there, especially in high school, is you don't know how many persons the person you're with has been with and how many people they have been with. And so you may actually be exposing yourself to the diseases of really quite a number of people. And having a variety of sexual partners, the next thing on here, just increases the chances of having all of these other kinds of sexual diseases. I have here a newspaper article that talks about venereal warts. They had venereal warts during the time of Christ, over 2,000 years ago. This is something that they thought was relatively rare in our country. It's something that is coming back with increasing in severity, and it's something that they're seeing more and more of it. Now, the danger of venereal warts, and I have an article here that I want to read to you, or a couple of excerpts from it. It says, acne, athletic injuries, drinking, drugs, and getting pregnant. These are the health issues of teenagers. Now add one that teenagers and their parents never dreamed was a concern: cervical cancer. It has long been known that the younger women are when they first have intercourse, and the more partners they have, the more likely they are to get cervical cancer. And the teen years have become a time of sexual activity for many American women. National experts say that there seems to be a dramatic increase in precancerous abnormalities found in teenagers and young adult women. Now, here's another article talking about this same type of cervical cancer. It says, a study of women with radically different sex lives, prostitutes, and monogamous Indians has found new evidence linking promiscuity to transmission of a virus that can cause cervical cancer. And they're saying that this virus is related to venereal warts, that not everybody that gets venereal warts gets cervical cancer, but nearly everybody that has cervical cancer has had venereal warts. And in testing these women, what they found out that both the prostitutes and these Indian women got married at a very early age. So they have ruled out the early age as being a problem if you're monogamous, if you're with one man. And they say these Indians are isolated, and there's not hardly any chance of any kind of adulterous relationship. If one of these Indians has a relationship with another man, her husband kicks her out, and these women are really motivated to be monogamous in these relationships. And so it says that we showed that women who had many children and who started sex at an early age didn't necessarily get venereal warts. He says this provides solid data that cervical cancer is a sexually transmitted disease. These Indians didn't have cervical cancer, whereas the prostitutes did. It says, and that the virus is the most important factor causing it, and that promiscuity is the form of infection. I have up here a cartoon. And here's a boy. He says, gee, Granddad, your generation didn't have all those social diseases. What did you wear to have safe sex? Granddad says, a wedding ring. And this is what the authorities nowadays that even don't believe in God anymore, then this is what they're coming back, and they're talking about that if you want to have safe sex, then the best thing for you to wear is not a condom, but a wedding ring. And then you're going to you're going to have a longer life, and you're going to enjoy this relationship more. Now, suppose a teenager, I've lost my chart here, because we're going down our list of an atheist, their choices. So here it is, they're thinking, maybe I just want to have, talking about having intercourse or a variety of sexual partners. then this can also cause, even if you don't get a venereal disease, this can also cause all kinds of mental hang-ups. Next week, when we study the Song of Solomon, we're going to see where the Shulamite is going to give Solomon quite a lecture and a very positive attitude towards this relationship. And we're going to see the role of the mind in a sexual relationship. And so when young people are training their body and affecting the way it responds, then they are affecting their mind and they're affecting the way that it responds. A lot of times, young girls, when they have a relationship in high school, then it's not a normal relationship. It's maybe a hurried relationship where there's a lot of guilt and a lot of anxiety attached with it. And sex turns out to be not all that great. Well, what's the big to-do about it? It wasn't all that much fun. And as a result of entering this relationship in an artificial way, many of these girls enter marriage with a negative attitude toward their sexual relationship. They make themselves frigid by all their sexual activity that doesn't please them, that doesn't give them satisfaction. Boys have problems. Boys that are involved in having sexual relationships with a girl in the back seat of a car, they're worried about somebody coming up on them, getting caught. They are teaching their bodies to respond in an artificial way. A husband and wife at home in their bedroom, in their bed, they have got all night long to play and to have fun with each other, to do whatever they want. They've got a wonderful atmosphere to teach their bodies how to respond. A young boy and a young girl are teaching their bodies how to respond in an artificial way. One cause, not all causes, but one cause of premature ejaculation for a man where he is unable to fully satisfy either his wife or himself is caused from premarital sexual relationships in the back seat of a car, teaching his body how to hurry up and get it over with before we get caught. He gets married, he's got all night, but he has taught his body how to respond in an artificial way, and now he has a real hard time unteaching his body. So we need to realize we are teaching our body how to respond, how to have fun, and we may be teaching our body something that we will really regret as the years go on and as we continue to, perhaps we're married and want to view this as a relationship to enjoy all of our married life. Then they have the choice of living together. And I think the quote I read to you last week was that people who live together have an 80% chance of getting a divorce, more so than people who are married, that they do not have the commitment, they have not made the emotional transition, and so they there's not this commitment and they are not as determined to solve problems and to grow and to mature in that way. I have here an article that talks about another danger of just having multiple sexual partners, and it talks about how that it says one of the reasons for premarital sexual abstinence may be the most significant. It says it happens that the sexual arousal of most of us can be conditioned very quickly. That's what I've been saying over and over. We train our body how to respond by the way we treat ourselves sexually during these forming years. So it says we can be conditioned very quickly, perhaps more readily than any other psychological response, by continual exposure to sexually stimulating books, pictures, movies, and other objects. We then make a fetish of those objects, and so a fetish is something we have to have for sexual arousal. So we make a fetish of those objects in that they become necessary for our sexual arousal. When a couple is sexually involved prior to the marriage commitment, they are conditioning themselves to respond to a fetish. The process is subtle and often devastating to sexual enjoyment after marriage. Here's why. There is in nearly everyone, especially those raised in Judeo-Christian culture, an awareness that premarital sex is wrong. It may be deeply buried, repressed, ignored, or openly justified, but it is there. Something deep inside each person engaged in illicit premarital sex says, we shouldn't be doing this. And that's what makes it exciting. There is something definitely stimulating in the wrongness and the illicitness of the act. The illicitness can be translated into other terms. What if someone finds out? I'll show my folks I can do what I want. See how much we love each other? No outdated church is going to control me. Whatever is said, that illicitness is part of the sexual arousal prior to marriage, and the couple are conditioning themselves to respond to it. Then the next section here, it says, something died on the wedding night. And this author says, I have talked with many married couples who have said, before we were married, we had a great sex life, exciting, fulfilling, and enjoyable. But on our wedding night, for some reason, it died. It has never been very good since. What happened on their wedding night? That illicitness, which had become a conditioned sexual stimulation, was taken away. After the formal wedding vows, no one would be offended by their living together. They were no longer proving anything to an authority figure. In fact, sex was now mandatory. When the illicitness was taken away, there was only a big, black, gaping hole in the relationship. Intimacy had broken down. So how does a person recapture that illicitness which makes sex so exciting? One simple method is to go have an affair. Bingo! Great sex again. There is also something in each of us that says extramarital sex is wrong. This seems to be the common solution today. So the marriage bonds crumble and the divorce rate climbs. So here it is, he's saying people condition their bodies to respond in an artificial way to illicitness and to have the excitement of doing something wrong rather than the excitement of doing something good that originated within the mind of God and to bless their union. You know, we have just left the Victorian age, and we're not all the way out of Victorian morals, where we have seen both men and women have tremendous hang-ups about the sexual relationship, where they denied themselves the right to enjoy that relationship, where they thought that surely God could not have been the author of sex and could not have designed it for men and women. And as I talk to people and read literature and listen to teenagers talk and to hear their attitudes of how they are conditioning their bodies by these illicit relationships, I am convinced that we are entering a new era of extreme sexual hang-ups that are going to be 100 times worse than anything we saw in the Victorian age. Because these type of activities, if we want to have fun, if we don't believe in God and we want to have fun and we want to get the most out of the sexual relationship, it's not through petting, it's not through masturbation, it's not through lovemaking with persons of the same sex, it's not by just having intercourse with maybe one person in high school or trying it out. A lot of times, in fact, the statistics say that a lot of teenagers think everybody's doing it. Everybody isn't doing it. At least 50%, and I've seen this in several articles from different sources, at least 50% of the teenagers have never had sexual intercourse. And of those who have had it, many of them have only had it one time and were turned off of it from that one time. So if we're going to have fun, it's not in experimenting and having intercourse. It's not in having a variety of sexual partners. And it's not in living together. It's in getting married, having one partner, learning together. There's a lot to be said for two virgins getting married. A man of being a virgin and a woman being a virgin, and learning together and developing this relationship so that it can be all that God intended for it to be and to be a wonderful relationship. Ann Landers, or Dear Abby, took some surveys on how many people had been unfaithful in their marriages. And here's someone wrote in and says, we're writing because we want to add to the number of couples who have never cheated. I'm 92 and my wife is 88. We've been married for 71 years, still have all our marbles, and enjoy every aspect of married life, although we have slowed up some in recent years because of arthritis. Here's someone else wrote, my husband and I just celebrated our 34th wedding anniversary, and if our sex life was any better, we couldn't handle it. I was 19 and he was 22 when we married. We were both virgins. I swear sex is the fountain of youth. My mother told me that the way to a man's heart was through his stomach, but I think I found a shortcut. So we find out if there is a better way to have fun. And this is a little survey that proves that Christians really do make the best lovers. These are 4 different surveys of couples. This first survey up here, this is of 151 college-age couples with premarital training. Dr. Herbert Miles gave these couples premarital counseling before they got married, Then he came back 6 months to a year after they had been married and had to fill out some survey questions to test their responses. He has a book, Sexual Happiness in Marriage. It's an excellent book. I have this old copy. I've noticed that he has a revised edition, and I haven't seen it. I'm sure I would highly recommend that book to you, and it's it's addressed to young people, this book. In his survey of 151 college-age groups, his survey was testing women who experienced an orgasm with their husband. So he's testing, this is a survey of sexual success to prove that Christians really do make the best lovers. 96.1% of these couples that he surveyed who had premarital training, they had success in their marriage relationship within 6 months to a year after they were married. So this goes along with what I told you earlier, that I've observed that the ones who learn about marriage before they get married, they start off on a higher plane and stay there. This next survey is of 1,700 couples who are quite a bit older than the college-age couples up here. They're older married couples who took the family life seminars that Tim LaHaye and his wife Beverly LaHaye, they go around the country teaching them. And he has a book out called The Act of Marriage, and you find the results of his survey there. These couples, who were both the man and the woman, are obviously interested in the marriage relationship and are studying and working and trying to apply Christian principles to their marriage. 89% of these women enjoyed orgasms with their husbands, so they had a high rate of marital success in their relationships. Now we come down here, this survey right here, this comes from a survey of 3,019 women of all ages and philosophies. You're familiar, I'm sure, with the Height Report. It's a book that came out several years ago. Had an article about it in the Reader's Digest that Share Height wrote this book, and she surveyed, just took a cross country of women without any respect to whether they were religious or whatever, just a cross section of women in our country and society. Only 49%, or about 50% of the women, with just a cross section of women, enjoy marital success, enjoy an orgasm with their husband, as compared to nearly 100% of women college age who have premarital counseling and learn what God has designed for this relationship. So just looking at this strictly from a worldly standpoint, if we want to have the most fun in life and get the most out of our sexual relationship, then it is to our advantage to learn God's teaching in regard to this relationship and apply it to our lives so that we can have success in this relationship. In fact, God probably spends more space in the Bible talking about the sexual relationship, both from a negative standpoint, don't do this, and a positive standpoint, this is what you do. God spends more space talking about that aspect of marriage than any other aspect of marriage, whether it's subjection or love or what have you. So this is obviously something that is very important. So if we want to have success and enjoy this relationship, then we see that Christians really do make the best lovers. This last one down here, this is also from the Height Report, Share Height's report, and this is represents 78% of the above women. So this is 78% of this 50%. So 50% of the women who achieved orgasms in marriage, 78% of this, so this is going to be a pretty healthy section of this percentage. 78% of the above women achieved orgasm through masturbation without a man. I made that, this should have been back over here like this. That's a misrepresentative of this 78%. So 78% of these women, you understand what I'm saying? I made this line too long. 78% of these women, they achieved their orgasm through masturbation without a man. And of course, to Share Height, there is nothing wrong with this, and she published this report to say, well, this is what women should do. Well, if 78% of 49%, if this is all that can get their happiness out of this type of relationship, this is really not a very high percentage at all. 78% and 49% is really not a very high percentage. But when you think about it from another standpoint, this is without the presence of a man. This is really lonely and inhibited. These women are unable to find their sexual thrills and their sexual happiness with a man. So it's a very self-centered, way that they are able to respond. So the whole point of this chart is to show that statistics prove that the better Christian you are, then the better lover you're going to be, the more happiness you're going to get out of this relationship. And next week, when we come back and see the Shulamite's little speech that she gives to Solomon, we're going to talk about the role of the mind, and we're going to see that the reasons Christians have this kind of success is because the Bible places the emphasis upon the mind, what you do with your mind. And when you train your mind right, then your body responds. It has just been within about the last 20 years that psychologists have really recognized the role of the mind in the sexual relationship. And so we're going to talk about that some again next week. One article that I read said that couples who have premarital counseling, who learn about this relationship before marriage, have 20 times the chance for happiness as those who don't. Now, I didn't say 20%. I said 20 times. And so I asked my husband, who's a mathematician, I said, how do I translate that into a percentage? He said, that is 2,000%. You have a 2,000% chance of happiness if you have premarital counseling and you learn about this relationship before marriage than if you don't. So the Song of Solomon, when we realize that God designed this for teenagers to be read and understood before marriage, that God really was looking out for the happiness of His people, and that He does want us to be happy. He wants us to enjoy this relationship. He wants us to get the most out of it. So God does love us. He does care for us, and He wants us to be happy.